Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin with our final session for today, session 3. There's a little overshot in terms of timing, but please do bear with us as we go through the final session for today's conference. The final session for the MiDAS-KAS 2022 conference is on the future outlooks on terrorism and counter-terrorism. It is an ongoing threat and an evolving one. Speakers in this session will give a preview of what forms of radicalization can be expected in the future and who the targets could be. It is said that the role of women in violent extremism is often overlooked, whether as perpetrators, mitigators, and victims. How significant is their role in terrorism, and how or why are they influenced? Our first speaker will touch on the involvement of women in terrorism and ways to tackle this issue. She is Professor Dr. Kartini Abu Talib, who is the Deputy Director at the Institute of Ethnic Studies at Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia. Professor Kartini has 14 years of progressive training and research experience at national and international levels. Trained as a policy analyst, she completed 5 major national policy papers for the government between 2014 and 2019. Her research and publications focus on public policy and ethnicity revolving around gender, civil society, comparative politics, and consumerism. The stage is yours, Professor.
Too short. Okay. Assalamualaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Greetings, everyone. Would you be able to hear me loud and clear? Won't be able to hear me? Okay, now it's clear. Okay, let me start. Assalamualaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Greetings, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, especially Miss Miriam Fisher, Miss Ng Chen over there, for making this research on women and de-radicalization commendable. Also, my compliment goes to PDRM, and I'm sure that there are a view of PDRM members, especially DCP Norma Ishak, DSP Wan Ruzailan, DSP Rais, and many more members of Unit E8 for helping this research relentlessly during COVID-19. And finally, my team. So without further ado, this is the exploratory research. So I know that everyone might have a deep, maybe questions regarding gender and de-radicalization. Why don't we start? I was informed that I have to control this myself. Okay. So for the introduction, we can see that the study of women and de-radicalization is at the margin. I use the word at the margin. Why? Because it's overwhelmed. The studies on terrorism is overwhelmed by male-dominated terrorism and reflections on them. So, but if we have to look at the Global Terrorism Index 2022, okay, it's just released, and we can see that the results emphasize the epicenter of terrorism is the sub-Saharan Africa region, not Southeast Asia. So we all can be rest assured and be more happy to know the current results simply still highlighted the global terrorism activities is pretty much concentrated in sub-Saharan. And if we going back to 7 years ago, 2015, the idea looking at globalization and terrorism still highly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Mentioned by Brenda Lutz and James Lutz in 2015, I can say that the bias has not changed. Okay. Again, terrorism, extremism, regional studies, statecraft. For all we know, terrorism and extremism are the product of discontentment. This is very important because we are going to now map the first two. Grievances and poverty is the top 5 top reasons for former female terrorists in terms of defining their scheme of action to join the terrorist organization. So if we look carefully, if we have to deduce one by one, we can say that grievances, unhappy, looking for an alternative, a lone wolf, and then the far-right movement, whatever ideology it's, whether it is fundamentalism, it's ended up random shooting. But when we look at the poverty is also open to exploitation. We can see fraud recruitment for the job ended up in the disastrous terrorist organization too. So these are part of the story that we have listened, we have heard from our respondent. And of course, rebellion, we have to be clear here, not all anti-establishment is terrorism, but rebellion movement may cause roughness and end up terrorizing people. So there is a gray area in distinguishing separatism, liberation, when violence is involved. We can always quote how Sri Lanka with Tamil Eelam, yes, the Southern Thai movement, the Mindanao, and we can see that the idea of separatism and liberation can be slightly be misunderstood and will be labeled under terrorism. We are not going to do that, okay? And of course, the discontentment, we look at the mercenary, the hired terrorists, the network of terrorism, regardless of gender, members are hired terrorists to destabilize country. Okay, so how do we connect all these to gender and terrorism? First and foremost, when we look at the discontentment list, grievances and poverty are the top reason for former female terrorists in terms of defining their scheme of action to join the terrorist organization. And we can see that from a study to explore women's engagement in post-terrorism activities in Malaysia was conducted in the year 2020 to 2021. It was really a tough pandemic time to conduct a fieldwork research. And of course, the scope of research was on rehabilitation and de-radicalization. And based on the unpublished data of the Royal Police Department Malaysia, we can see that from 2013 to 2019, there were 483 detainees caught for terrorism charges. Out of this total, 150 were non-citizens, 436 were males, and 43 were females. We consider that it's just a small number, but small number can get bigger over time, over years. So the study utilized narrative interview. This is a tool of analysis introduced by Friedrich Schütze, a German sociologist, with 5 former female detainees of SOSMA, connecting them with ISIS and Daesh activities. Okay, let's move on to reasons and more. I hope that I could finish in 15 minutes. Okay, so again, looking at reasons and more, as I said earlier, when it comes to discontentment, the first two, no source of income or unemployment, poverty, and then we can see the promising offer of work for recruitment, later trapped in the terrorist organization, grievances pretty much associated to self-repent and redemption due to horrible life in the past. And they see that they have carried a lot of deadly sins and decided to redeem themselves, particularly female, former detainees who say that this is in the name of heaven. Okay, so much of heaven, okay? And then we can see that another issue is finding a soulmate, is another reason shared by the former detainees. They say women need love. Of course, everyone needs love. And ready to start. They're ready to start a new life with unknown means due to physical attraction. Okay, they are quite blunt when it comes to explaining and expressing themselves. And we can see the ignorance of Islamic knowledge is another reason. Let us, why don't we here try to establish that Islamic-based school do not breed terrorists or terrorism, because based on the exploratory research, we identified that most female detainees' backgrounds indicated that they lack Islamic learning, and most did not go to Islamic school. So these, we can consider that their ignorance harms them. Okay. Next is looking at the mix with the wrong crowd or joined the wrong network, and later unable to escape or too weak to break free. Okay, in the simple words. And the final reason is looking at how women being viewed having these vulnerable characters become the target of terrorist agenda to persuade, influence, and later recruit and exploit them. Because one of the story that we received from one of our RTD findings, women willing to offer sexual services to men willing to be martyrdom. Anyone declared that they're martyrdom, they're willing to actually serving them. So it's really a sad story to hear, kind of a mind-blowing to me, how easy things can be brainwashed. And rehabilitation and de-radicalization process. As we all know, we have listened to from morning until now, we can see that Malaysia practices a three-pronged approach to combat violence, particularly looking at the legal approach, rehabilitation approach, and education. In terms of instilling good values and culture, we can hear loud and clear from Ms. Mala and how the organizations from the government involved, the non-profit organization, industry also, in terms of providing ways to instill good values and culture for people to stay at peace and reject any violence, ideology, or radical movement. Anyway, when we look at the resorting to a punishment and criminality approach alone will not be the solution to curb and to prevent extremism and terrorism. Of course, it requires mind and soul. So therefore, the cooperation to prevent the act of terrorism involve local agency, from government, non-state actors to state actors, and also the international intelligence. We can hear loud and clear from Mr. Mark also how the EU and the international organization are willing to coordinate with local agency in terms of providing ways to prevent terrorism. So the de-radicalization program for this rehab and de-radicalization program is divided into two sections. One section is to identify criminals arrested under POTA and POCA, and section 2, identified criminal arrested under SOSMA. What are the difference? So these are the simple diagram to look at how both rehabilitation and de-radicalization approaches provide treatments for a person detained under POCA, POTA, and SOSMA, and everyone must know that the maximum sentences for both, whether being arrested under POCA or POTA or SOSMA, is maximum 2 years. What the diagram is trying to say is that the length of the program and the unit responsible for managing the rehab and de-radicalization, looking at SOSMA, POCA, and POTA, is about the process involve action to restore someone's life through training, therapy, consultation, counseling during the imprisonment. And it also, if following to the next rehab process, we can see that they also focus on how to provide entrepreneurial skills, helping them to move, to be prepared, to be ready to be integrated in the society. So again, when you look at the rehab process, the rehabilitation treatment is conducted during detention. And during this detention, we can see that they are being monitoring. And of course, even after the release, they have been monitored again and again. And it seems like during the rehab process, the detainees' family also are encouraged to engage in the program as a support system to build or to rebuild their confidence and trust before detainees are released. If you look at the arrow, they have the assessment, and if they assess one of the detainees are not yet changed in terms of their attitudes, way of thinking, and perspective regarding extremism or terrorism, they will be going back to the circle again, even though the maximum is 2 years. After the maximum of 2 years, the frequency of monitoring depends on the category of terrorism activities. They have this white zone, yellow zone, and the third category is the red zone. So it's depending on which detainees in which zone of that level of extremism. And of course, based on what the officer told us, they keep monitoring these detainees and be willing to visit them at their home and see what is still need in terms of capacity and assistantship, helping them to be able to continue the life. Okay, so gaps and improvement, especially attending female detainees, we can see that looking at all 30 modules prepared by the authorities, they are still lacking in terms of providing a module for training of trainers, particularly during the rehab process. it will be suggested them to renew how they approach on media literacy. None of this, when it comes to module of rehab, mention about how they have to deal with media. And nowadays we know that based on this global report, based on this global terrorism index, we can see that the active ways of terrorism using advanced technologies, including drones, GPS system, and encrypted messaging services, has not been informed and not been taught to these detainees on how to use properly the media literacy, and how to screen this information and not simply be swayed or influenced of this social media. And of course, there is no model for e-commerce. They do have the entrepreneurial skill attached to them, training them to be a better persons outside, whether in terms of looking at traditional methods for women. They teach how to sew. They teach how to make creative, unique, traditional accessories, those being taught to them. But yet again, knowing that the global world is moving into e-commerce, it would be good to have a module for additional skill, for the preparatory program before returning, before these detainees return to the society, and provided that the government can continuously actively provide financial support as a head start. And the collaboration between government and NGOs for community engagement, and for me, it looks still dormant, but listening to Ms. Mala, I would change my mind. It would be good to actually seeing them be able to tailor program according to capacities and to build trust, community trust, focus on how to create activities based on community focus rather than community target, and be able to inform them whether through mode of physical or virtual approach. And again, method and knowledge to understand other religious extreme movement. As we said, we are so biased looking at just Islam as the fundamentalism, but none of us has the knowledge and capacity to deconstruct or even to understand the other movement of extreme movement within, whether it is Hindu, whether it is Buddha, whether it is Christian. We are facing super diversity society. We are no longer about Malay, Chinese, Indian, but the coming of migrants from Bangladesh, from Myanmar, who are sub-ethnic group, might not be able to dissect easily. So we do not have that capacity to learn, and it will be good to suggest way to find the expert in looking at and expand this aspect. And of course, human resource management, rotation and transfer create shortages of skilled staff training in counter-terrorism. The moment they rotate or move to a different place, they have to teach again new skill members in terms of how they conduct the idea of training, rehab, and also engaging with these detainees or former detainees. Of course, as the conclusion, Malaysia, of course, we have to know, we have to support that Malaysia is against any form of violence and is always prepared for moderation in resolving social deficit. I know one of the members did mention about concerning the ethnic riot 1969. Of course, we acknowledge that in our society there is always a context of agree to agree and agree to disagree. But yet again, this context of differences of disagreement can always find a solution through bargaining, negotiation, and mediation. This is very active among Malaysians. And the experience of managing and winning the battle against the communists, this is also the past experience of battling the communists was the crucial key for the state to operate its own tool, tactics, and intelligence in terms of how they approach radical movement and how to simply conduct and reject any violence. So in my final word, the state will continue its commitment to improve security and safety and will make society reject violence in many ways. We have this unity, national unity policy, pretty much looking at layers of the society and how to engage them together and improving the way we look and strengthen our trust. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kartini. A lot of interesting insights. Now, ladies and gentlemen, social media has been a powerful platform, an instrument that has been used for the greater good, but at the same time, exploited too. When it comes to extremism, social media has indeed played a substantial role. The next presentation is on how social media can become a tool for unity and division in extremism. Our second speaker is Dr. Nurul Meza Muhammad Rashid, an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge and Human Sciences at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, IIUM. She has been involved in various local and international programs related to preventing and countering violent extremism as a subject matter expert. Aside from violent extremism, she is also a crafting expert in media psychology. Her current research project explores how to build resilience among ex-detainees convicted for violent extremism-related offences. With that, over to you, Dr. Nurul Meza.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. If you don't mind, I'm going to try to check if this is working. Okay, great. Thank you to Ms. Nadia, the moderator of today, as well as also thank you, Ms. Miriam Fisher, for having me as well, and also for continuing to stay until the end of the event, and also Dr. So my topic is on the social media and extremism, the tool for unity and division. This topic will discuss on how the use of social media by us can be a place for unity and division, fostering extreme ideologies. In the worst case scenario, of course, we could have social media encouraging online and physical forms of violence. I want to start with a quote from one of my favorite philosophers on media studies. This is Marshall McLuhan saying that as the unity of the modern world becomes increasingly a technological rather than a social affair, should we be concerned? Because ever since the first studies of media, we have focused on the aggression aspect. We immediately assume that media causes aggression. But for today, I do want to highlight that, as I mentioned about unity and division, I also hope that I can highlight that it can be both a tool for promoting peace, but at the same time, it can also be a cause for aggression. My topic will cover on media and extremism, identity, media and extremism, and future practices. I want to look at the understanding of social identity, which is a common topic in actually studies of extremism, but also a very, very important item in understanding social psychology. Also, I look at the selected psychological theories, mainly on social identity theory, the current understanding of social media use, and the process of radicalization and extremism, how it relates to them. Now, because social media is an area that has garnered great attention, media and extremism is something that has existed for a very, very long time. It did not escape the media studies experts as well as extremist experts, how they are together often. It is a convoluted interrelationship, as Matusis mentioned, and Margaret Thatcher, the late Margaret Thatcher, mentioned that publicity is the oxygen of terrorism, therefore media is a much needed item in extremism, like widespread. It's also that as if they coexist like a red and white blood cells. Now, media is a major, big aspect. Of course, it covers newspapers, it covers television, it covers also digital media. Now, the interesting thing about digital media is that compared to newspapers and television, it actually provides audiences to participate equally. So digital media itself is an open space for a wide range of audiences all around the globe. That means that they themselves can create the narrative, they themselves can actually identify with the extremist groups. They can also further exacerbate or possibly try to minimize the influences of radicalization on the online spectrum and if, of course, in the physical spectrum as well. We have audiences all around the globe that might find extremist content interesting and attractive, or otherwise. They might even search and disseminate extremist content online, or again, remove it from the public. What we need to consider as researchers and practitioners in the field of security, as well as in, of course, violent extremism, what are the platforms that are being used? Whose opinions do they seek out? Now, this is referring to the radical extremist opinions. We have covered about ideologies. We have covered about how ideologies could foster from geopolitical events. We have covered about even opinions and perspectives. So, we need to answer whose opinions are they seeking out to. I'm referring to the users of social media, and I'm referring to those who find contents of social media related to extremism as attractive. We need to understand whether they seek out to group or individual opinions and who these people are. How do they engage and how frequently do they engage with the content and the users they identify on social media? And I hope that, ladies and gentlemen, we equally can reflect on how we use social media. Who do we identify with? And how come we can confidently say that we are not radicals, but they are individuals who might be radical? I'm going to introduce you to, I'm not sure, some of you might be familiar with this theory, but some of us might be new to this theory. So this is a very, very important theory. It's known as social identity theory. It's about identity, who we are. Social identity theory says that every individual, that means all of us here, has a need to feel categorized, has a need to feel belong. We want to identify with a social group, or we want to identify with a group itself to form an identity. Starting with, what's our name? Are we a Muslim? Are we a teacher? Are we a student? Are we a radical or non-radical? And trust me, no radical extremist would say they are radical, or someone might want to argue with me on that perspective. Going into identity, I'm going to stick to creating an identity might allow an individual to identify to whom they belong while teaching them those who are different to them. A process parallel to the radicalization process, creating extreme ideologies. There is us and there is them. Us could be referring to those who I identify with. It could be referring to my friends, my comrades, my members, my family, people who actually would fight alongside of me, and them would be those who would be against me, who would try to ruin me. How does social media get involved in the tool of extremism and identity? So social media could assist individuals in continuously conducting activities to enhance knowledge about who they are, related to searching information and recent events so that they can understand, who am I, how should I think, what should I do? Now, this division could occur due to differing values, opinions, and thoughts because of the creating of the identity itself. So when we're talking about social media and extremism and how it becomes a tool for unity and division, from the first aspect, not all of us is like us. We identify those who are them. And this could actually divide us. This could actually cause us to have different thoughts and values. But also at the same time, it could also be a form of unity on social media. It could occur as we find out who we identify more with, whose thoughts are aligned with us. Now, for the division part, it could lead to intergroup conflict, as we have seen in radical processes. And the unity aspect, on the other hand, it could lead to in-group harmony. Now, the two, if we can fully understand it, it could be also a tool for us to actually counter or combat against radicalization, or even try our best to understand how actually human functioning works. So for the situation on how social media and extremism is combined, we need to also understand about geopolitical factors. For example, war or pandemic. Users of social media all over the world not only rely on social media for news on recent events, but also seek out for opinions for others to know how they might or should feel about their situation. This is in relation to our identity as well. Most of the time, not all individuals can come up with their own ideas, come up with their own understanding of recent events. Sometimes they try to ask, what does my leader think of this situation? What does people equal to me think of this situation? And we often see social media postings, even among extremist groups, saying that as a ... You can fill in the blanks with anything, because I do not want to paint a particular group as an extremist, because I feel that anyone and any ideology could potentially cause radicalization process to occur. And the issue is that recruiters are well aware of this. There are instances where stories of events, for example, someone like us, someone who is in the group as us, are like sharing a story about us, about them, to identify, so that they allow members, users of social media to identify and feel more attached to the unfolding events. Now, these stories are shared on social media. Sharing these stories, we have seen stories that has gone viral about maybe like a young child, and I have heard an account, a narrative by an ex-detainee of violent extremism themselves saying that as a person who shares the same identity as this person, I feel angry. I feel that I should do something. They see this on social media shared by their friends, they further share it, and it further ignites certain amount of anger, certain amount of depression among them, that leads to actually an actual movement in violent extremism. Of course, we are, it could be in two folds as mentioned. What if this happens to me? So they feel united, they feel identified with the narrative. Or the person did something that harmed my people. So you start to divide yourself with people who might not be a similar category as you. So there's the division aspect. But it's not just about the story. The divide could also be about finding people who agree or disagree with their thoughts and opinions. So let's say that we're sharing a story about a conflict. We found out that the person actually shares a story that is in disagreement with you. You identify a new enemy, and then further creates the division and reluctance to hear alternative sides. This happens a lot during times of uncertainty, for example, the pandemic and also conflict. Now, in relation to the future practices, I'm nearing to the end of my presentation. I do want to talk about how do we overcome this and actually have more questions rather than answers. Maybe yes, we can try to foster and encourage intergroup harmony through increased contact. Can we actually do that? Are people willing? How do you make 7 billion people nearing to 8 billion people all meeting each other? Encourage respectful intercommunication while valuing differences. Just now, I actually communicated about with one of the members in this audience, the fear of meeting someone who are not like us. Because we feel that what if we are wrong in our own thoughts and ideas? What if we were wrong? Can we actually deal with the fact that we didn't have the knowledge? We didn't do the right thing? Coming to terms with that can also be a factor why we don't want to hear the other side. But of course, we also need to look at the research aspect and also professional practices. We need to see how we can engage more with various academic experts, NGOs, professional practices, and community leaders down to our own citizens. This is something that we should be concerned about. How well do we know the people who are affected by violent extremism? How well do we understand what they are, what they know, what they don't know? Why were they affected? Did we put our own interpretation? Did we put our own narrative into their mind? This could actually be dangerous because we don't know whether it's effective or not. We don't know whether they actually have their own ideas. Because again, like I mentioned about current events and also basically a lot of geopolitical factors, sometimes we try our best to actually paint an equal story, a one true story, but evidences have showcased that people can interpret it differently. There are still questions we need to ask. How do we prevent individuals from being deeply influenced by the us versus them narrative to prevent violence? This is actually still an open question. In a democratic nation, is it possible to restrict social media communication to protect national and individual safety? Because we have seen over and over again, people will always post what they need to post, what they feel like posting. Then there will be always someone else or millions of other people who would respond to that posting. Some of them might be vulgar, some of them might be very insulting. However, should we restrict those? Can we restrict those? Is that a possibility? Because what does it say about freedom of speech? But at the same time, we can also question, if we allow these individuals to speak, what does it say about public safety, national security, and even individual safety? I want to bring to this quote. I think it's a frequent quote among us Muslims. So this is from Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 13. O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is all-knowing and acquainted. Another quote is that the essence of the beautiful is unity and variety. Even though we might be divided in our opinions, we might be divided in our thoughts, however, if we possibly can come to terms that maybe violence is not the option, and we also have to be ready that not everyone can agree with us, that might be the path towards our better future. Could be a future outlooks on counter-terrorism, rather than trying to paint one true narrative. Maybe we should see how there might be varieties and a lot of things in this world. And that's it. That's my presentation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nurul Miza. It's quite remarkable how social media can be used as a tool for not just unity but division as well. Now, our final speaker for today is Mr. Thomas Caruth Samuel, who is the Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism researcher. He specializes in countering terrorist narratives, the role of education in countering violent extremism, and youth radicalization. He has worked at the Southeast Regional Center for Counter-Terrorism at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Malaysia from 2004 to 2019 and was the Director of Research and later the Director of Digital Strategic Communications Division. Currently, he is pursuing his PhD focusing on the role of the quest for personal significance in motivating terrorism among Malaysian youths. His presentation will focus on non-violent radical extremist groups and whether there is a cause for concern.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nadia. Mrs. Miriam Fisher, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Encik Hisham, MiDAS, my fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I understand that it's only me and absolute freedom that stands in between, so I'll be quick. I just want to share with you some of my thoughts, some of my questions with regards to this non-violent radical extremist groups. Now, we have spent much of the time talking about violent extremist groups, and it's quite clear. Most people will say that is a cause of concern. But what happens if we are talking about non-violent radical extremist groups? Somebody asked me, is that even possible? Can you actually have non-violent radical extremist groups? I would like to argue there is. So when we talk about violent extremist groups, right, we talk about stuff like this, whether it's 9/11, Madrid train bombing, the middle picture below is the Bali bombing, or right down to the Lockerbie tragedy. Remember the Pan Am flight which exploded, and even 11 people in the village of Lockerbie died from that. So when we talk about violent extremism, most people are clear that that's wrong, that's bad, that's evil, right? Oh, hold on, let me just take time just to make sure I don't pass. So that's clear. So then, is this such a big deal? You know, I was speaking to a police officer, not from Malaysia, from another country, and he said, Thomas, is this such a big deal? Let them just talk, lah. I mean, let them just express themselves. Let them just say whatever they want to say. As long as they don't get engaged in violence. If not, why? I mean, Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example. You have groups, many kinds of groups. In Europe, for example, you have some supremacist groups. Many of them, they just demonstrate, they do protest, they are quite sometimes inciting in their words, but they don't actually participate in direct violence. Is this a big deal? So, as I mentioned, I have many people who have told me, no, it's not. Thomas, we've got so many people who are actively trying to kill. Let's focus on them and not these guys, you know. So my question is this: can non-violent radical extremist groups lead to violent extremism? And that's my premise. And I'd like to share that based on what I have been talking to some of these chaps, I would like to suggest that there are a cause of concern. So let's look at the phenomenon of non-violent yet radical groups. I'm going to give what to look out for. What do they speak about? Number one, they're very exclusive, you know. They're very exclusive group of people. It's a group, and not anybody can enter that group, either by race or by culture or by religion or by ideology or set of beliefs. They belong to a specific group, and it's us against them, which is our second point, binary thinking. So whenever you have a group which focuses on exclusivity, focuses on binary thinking, 1-0, either you're with us or against us, and all of them have this victim mentality. Look, we have been mistreated. We have been mistreated by the Muslims, we have been mistreated by the Westerners, we've been mistreated by the Jews, we've been mistreated by the government, by the rich people. They always have a victim mentality, meaning that there is somebody out there who has been the aggressor. So one interesting thing is you find that these non-violent radical groups, they're very different from each other, but they share these same elements. They always have an enemy. In fact, that's sometimes the uniting thing. It's the Jews, it's the government, it's the Muslims, it's the Hindus. There is a group that they need to target as the enemy. And of course, you have to blame them, right? Now, here is where it gets interesting. At times, they're very inciting in the way they put forth their propaganda. And that's a cause of concern. Now, sometimes, as mentioned by Dr. Miza, they even border into hate speech. Now, the thing about hate speech is, in many places, it might not necessarily be a crime. If you say, I want to kill the president, technically, right, in the States, for example, that's not a crime. If you say, I want to kill Joe Biden, then perhaps then they can take you in. So many a times, the hate speech, they border on something which is not exactly criminal. And even sometimes they go one step further on glorification of violence. Now, a few years back, you could actually do that and get away with it. You could say terribly inciting things, but as long as you don't physically do anything, you're off the hook. Let me give you an example. Hizb ut-Tahrir. They reject the idea of a nation state/democracy while advocating for a caliphate. Now that's a radical idea, Jamaah Islami at one point, right? Radical idea. They want a caliphate, but they were violent. But you have some groups who took the idea but were not violent. So they say political authority should belong solely to God. I met one of them. He said, you cannot have a member of parliament because a member of parliament is chosen by people. That people could be non-religious people, not allowed. Any system not based on religious law is illegitimate. That means democracy, parliament, completely illegitimate because it's man-made laws. Men are making laws. Separate your lives from the infidels. Now, regardless of the group, they keep saying this. Yeah? And of course, they focus on infiltration rather than violence. So they say things like, look, we want to persuade others to come and believe our idea. Not through violence. We don't want to force them. We don't want to kill them. We don't want to give them fear. But we want to persuade them and explain to them in a nice way. And perhaps they will embrace our ideas. What's wrong with that? There's one guy telling me, what's wrong with that? Looks good, yeah? So again, let's consider this chap, Omar Bakri. Now, he started off in Hizb ut-Tahrir in the late 90s. Then he went on to start Al-Muhajirun. Why? He said, as he was in Hizb ut-Tahrir, he said, look, great stuff that they're doing, but it's not going to achieve its goals. And that's when he went one step further. And that's my point I'm trying to make here. The problem with this not yet violent radical groups is this. Many a times, they're very conducive and they are the enablers that allow its members sometimes to then move on to something a little bit more violent. This is our former E8 chief, Dato' Ayub. He was talking about monitoring non-violent radical groups. And he says it's a thin line that separates them from the militants. So I remember him saying, Thomas, they're very clever, They don't do anything that breaks the law. But they come very, very close to it. And we know they're heading that direction. We know they're inciting. But when we go to court of law, we can't prove anything. He mentioned specifically Hizb ut-Tahrir here. Generation identity. Interesting group. Huh? One of Europe's fastest growing and most prominent far-right movements. It was set up in France 6 years ago, branches in a few countries. Now they estimate to have thousands of activities, and more importantly, they have a lot of followers when they are online. They have that symbol, the yellow lambda. Okay, and these guys, for example, they are very much anti-migrants, and they, of course, they say they are not violent. Yeah. Advocates of defense of what is seen as the identity and culture of white Europeans from what it calls the great replacement by immigration and Islamization. Now, the idea of great replacement, you hear that later on. Now, GI has its roots in the identitarian movement, which sees Europe's identity as white and Christian, that began in France after the Second World War and is currently enjoying a resurgence. GI presents itself as a patriotic movement and claims to be non-violent and non-racist. Evidently, you can see from that picture, non-violent and non-racist. Yeah? So that's what they claim to be. Yeah. Now, interestingly, you have Brenton Tarrant. Now, you all know who that chap is, right? He was a shooter in New Zealand who went to the mosque and killed. Now, on 15 March 2019, he was charged with 50 counts of murder and 39 counts of attempted murder. He donated money to Generation Identity. He identified with that group. See, this is where we have to be careful. No? Why would somebody who is a violent extremist want to identify himself with this particular group? And so if you look at what he posted out there, you see that many of the ideas that he started off with is very, very similar to Generation Identity. And that's my problem with them. So you have what academics call the safety valve theory. In engineering, if you have a locomotive train, you have the safety valve. The idea is this, when steam accumulates, there's too much pressure, so you need to give it a safety valve, a release, so that they can release. And I have colleagues who tell me, Thomas, these radical but not yet violent groups are like that. Let them just release, let them just speak it out. What's the harm? They're not doing any harm anyway. And then you have those who believe in the conveyor belt theory. You guys go to the airport, you put your luggage, right? It comes from one place, it goes around, and it comes to you. It's a conveyor belt. Now, let me just briefly explain this. So, the safety valve theory is a philosophical justification of the utility of protest. That means it gives you the avenue to voice out your protest against the government, against status quo, against something that you're displeased with. So it's basically saying, look, if you disagree with something, voice it out. So which is what Hizb ut-Tahrir says. We disagree with the parliamentarian system in Indonesia. We think that's wrong. So we voice it out. What's wrong with that? So if we follow this theory, citizens are free to make statements concerning controversial societal issues, to express their displeasure against government and its policies. Again, the advocates of this say, what's wrong with that? For the conveyor belt theory, on the other hand, which is, let me be honest, this is what I subscribe to, ideology as the main precursor to violent extremism. If you have a violent ideology, even if you do not engage in violent behavior, that's a warning sign. Now, what's ideology? Now, there's fantastic definitions of ideology. It's very simple. It's actually three things. Number one, it tells you what is the problem. Number two, it tells you who is responsible for the problem. Number three, it tells you how to solve the problem. 3 parts. And you know, if you check terrorists, right, you know, sometimes academics, I mean, not all academics, but some academics, they tend to complicate stuff and they give you paragraphs and paragraphs of what ideology is. But these guys, right, these violent extremists, right, or not radical but not yet violent extremists, their ideology is very simple, you know. What is the problem? The problem is the West. Who is responsible? The government in the West. How do we solve the problem? Take them down. Very simple, very easy. Anybody can understand. So my point here is this. As long as you have an ideology which is based on violence, which is very radical, we need to be careful. We cannot wait for them to become violent before we act. In Malaysia, for example, in the past, we had the Internal Security Act. You don't actually have to do anything wrong. As long as you have intention to, or you voice out certain things, the government felt at that time that they had the right to arrest you for the greater good. Now, there's always danger with this. I'm going to go on. So, the conveyor belt theory is very simplistic. The idea is you start off green, you're perfectly okay. Then over a period of time, as you go through the conveyor belt, you become yellow, slightly more radical, and then you become red, which is you are violent. Now this is a bit simplistic, right? Some people propose that it's a funnel system in which you start off green and then some go in and actually end up red and actually become radicalized into violent action, but some don't. And some, on the other hand, goes back the opposite direction. But I would like to suggest that regardless of the direction, we have to be careful. Because more and more we find that the supporters of violent extremism oftentimes are connected with radical but not violent extremism. And that's a cause of concern. Ed Hussein, he said this: certain worldviews, even when held without advocating violence, provides the mood music that encourages terrorist acts. Mood music, you want a romantic setting, right? You play the right mood music. Same thing. Not radical but not yet violent extremist groups, they provide that mood music, that environment that enables you or enables that individual to then perhaps move on to violent extremism. So, now, many people say they are non-violent. They're non-violent what? But I would like to argue it's not so much that they are non-violent. They are not yet violent. So if you ask these guys, right, they will tell you, we are not violent now. Because, strategically speaking, it's not to our advantage for us to be violent at this point. We want members. So at this point, we are not violent. So when they say non-violent, right, we must not get the idea that these are Gandhis, These are Gandhi saying satyagraha, civil disobedience. We are not violent people. No, these chaps actually advocate not yet violence. At this particular time, we believe we should not be violent. At one point, there were certain groups in JI who said, look, it's not conducive, Jamaah Islam, it's not conducive now for us to be violent, Simply because the authorities, they started Task Force 88, they were just decapitating the leadership, and so they decided to take one step back. But this guy, Abu Rusdan, he was quite honest. He said this: JI would only be peaceful up to a point. Up to a point. We will use violence when we think it right for us to do so. Abu Bakr Bashir, they asked him, many people, right, students from your school, they end up as violent extremists. You are responsible for that. And this is what he said. One of my colleagues actually interviewed him. This is what he said to our colleague: I am only a craftsman selling knives. I am not responsible for how those knives are used. So his point was this: look, I'm an old person. That's why he told the press, can you believe this? The government thinks I am a terrorist. He pointed his walking stick. Yeah, I am a terrorist. They believe I to be a terrorist. Because the idea was, he was trying to say, I don't do anything per se, but we know, the people who went to his school. So how do we deal with them? We could criminalize and then punish. We can't do that, It's difficult. What do you want to do? As soon as you have a violent thought, put them to jail? They might not have broken any law. But we can create awareness on their danger. And of course, we can engage to investigate, counter, and debunk them. So I spoke about generation identity, and that's what certain investigative journalists did. They went undercover, they went to France, and they mixed with them, talked to them, interviewed them, and then they let the public know what they really were up to. And France banned them. So that's what perhaps we could do. So what's our conclusion? What's my conclusion? Non-violent radical groups are a potential threat as they exploit the freedom to express their opinions, to incite and glorify violence without ever engaging in actual violence. They are exploiting the space that is given to them. Number two, they might not do the actual violence, but provide the mood, music, and environment that enables others to be radicalized into violent extremism. Number three, how do we counter such phenomenon? By engaging them in the marketplace of ideas. Now, I'm not suggesting we put them into prison. It doesn't work nowadays, But we need to engage them, give sophisticated, articulate the arguments well, and win the people over. How do we do this? Confront their lies by speaking out the truth with love. In the country where the idea of winning, the term winning hearts and minds, made here in Malaysia, it's made in Malaysia, was birthed. Perhaps we need to revisit this idea and repurpose it to fit the current challenges. Now I'm going to end with this short story. Very short. There was this man, he was working in a construction site, very valuable construction site, yeah? And every day, and of course they had a lot of expensive things in this construction site, and every day, right, he would take a wheelbarrow, and in that wheelbarrow there was a box. And he would take it out and take it out with him. Now the guard would stop him and say, hey, look, what do you have there? And he would say, well, there's sawdust in this box, sawdust. And the guard would say, yeah, right, sawdust in the box. I want to check it. And the guard would open it and look carefully and pull it out. It was just sawdust. The guard would say, okay, strange, but go ahead. Next day, the same guy, wheelbarrow, taking a box out. And the guard says, what is this? He said, sawdust. The guard says, you can't be possibly taking sawdust. It's worthless, worth nothing. No, let me check. He checks it all out again. And he's so suspicious. The guard is so suspicious. Something is wrong here. But he checks it and it's still sawdust. He says, okay, go ahead. The third day, the same guy comes in, another box. And then the guard says, look, I know you're doing something wrong. I just don't know what it is. Let's make a deal. You tell me what you are doing and I won't prosecute you. I'll just keep it a secret between the both of us. What are you doing? And the guy goes, I'm stealing wheelbarrows. So oftentimes, right, we are so caught up in looking whether the group is a violent group or a not violent group. If it's not violent, never mind. It's okay, let it go. But I would like to suggest that we need to look deeper. Now, I'm not suggesting that we just put them all into prison. We need to engage these radical but not yet violent groups, because I would like to suggest that it is from them that some of the individual members could be radicalized. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas Kurl Samuel. We have come to the end of today's conference, but before we officially conclude, I would like to open up the floor for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, or if we have any online, also let's take some questions before we wrap up today's session. Any questions? Or are we ready to head back already? With that, I think we'd like to say thank you to our esteemed speakers for session 3. Let's take one question. I see a hand raised up. Let's take one question.
Okay, I'm Lieutenant Lisa from the Malaysian Defence College. Okay, I'm quite interested about the female extremism. Okay, it's related to my research paper. So I just want to know that what is your view, Dr. Kartini, about because you conduct the interview with the detainees. Okay, what is the main factors that they are willing to involve with the terrorism? That's number one. Number two, for the Dr. Iza, okay, the media social, we know that it's a very comprehensive tool to them to be influenced by the terrorist activities. So what is the collaboration within the agencies? Because it means that here, there is more of the social groups mooted right now. So I see that there is more on the various of the groups. Some are non-Muslim and Muslim also in there. So what is the mitigation of the local authorities in here to mitigate the content of the extremists in that particular of the socials? And the last one is about the thing that why the female been selected by the terrorists to participate in the terrorism. In doing that, for example, in the Indonesia, they are willing to have a good, not good, the drastic actions, also like they are being a suicide bomber. Okay, which is we feel that female doesn't do that action, but they are extremists to do that and have a damages in terms of the public. That's it. Thank you.
I think let me answer the last question on the suicide bomber. Okay, we have to know that the one that invented female suicide bomber is in Sri Lanka. Tamil Elam. Tamil Elam always refer themselves as the fighter for separatism, for their own independence of Sri Lanka. I do not know whether we should consider them terrorism, but others have reviewed and see and labeled them as terrorism. And you must know that first suicide bomber inventor was female fighter in Sri Lanka, Tamil Elam. Okay, going back to suicide bomber in Indonesia, we can see that from Mr. Mark's presentation on Bali incident, quite remarkable tragedy, quite sad to know that women can simply influence and be able to carry such a deadly weapon. One of the reasons is that, going back to one of the reasons, women's vulnerability side. If they are married, the loyalty to the husband seems to be the priority. It's very compelling for them to follow the husband because they believe that that is the shurga, the heaven for them. If the husband is involved in the terrorist organization, they are being willing to be part of that and willing to carry those loyalty in the name of heaven. I've been listening that story from the ex-detainees. But as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, two main reasons for women to get involved in this terrorist organization. One is the grievances and the poverty. Most of them were unemployed. They don't have nothing to hold upon, and they are still looking for job and suddenly active on social media and being influenced by the good look of the people who actually connected to them and willing to marry them, and they got into this kind of fraud emotion feeling and later trapped in this terrorist organization and hard to break free. So poverty is one of them. So if the society willing to look into how we can help women to be more active and engaged, whether in industry, in employment, in community-based organization, that could help women to divert the idea of looking and searching. Back in the traditional society, we can see that when it comes to jodoh, finding soulmate, there is always a community that concerned and try to propose. But in the modern day, where individuality is much more compelling in maneuvering one's life, it seems like that part there's a gap for the society. And then, of course, the idea of privacy and the idea of individual preference. So we have to balance all these indicators on how we can help women.
Right, thank you, Professor Kartini. Thank you to our speakers, Professor Kartini. Dr. Nurul Miza, you'd like to add something?
There was a question directed at me. I think
Okay.
I'll make it simple. So because social media is, itself is very multi-dimensional, we have the users, we have also the creators, the one that actually like basically sustains the social media platform. We also have the authority. I think your question is directed to the authorities' way of mitigating. We have, of course, the SOF approach by CSAT themselves, doing like, awareness program, understanding about online hate speech. Those are among things. It's also educating individuals about because it's easy for us when we know what kind of extremist ideologies are out there. So that actually helps both the public as well as authorities to identify using it as indicators for easy, basically kind of like a heuristic manner to know, okay, these are the ones that we have to watch out for. But I do want to highlight the fact that it might not be 100% effective, because if you're looking for 100% effectiveness, we need more research. We need more basically the understanding of how powerful social media is and how powerful certain extremist ideologies are as well. And also lastly, of course, how powerful human mind is as well. Thank you.
Mr. Thomas, would you like to add anything before we sign off? All right, with that, thank you to our speakers once again, Professor Kartini, Dr. Nurul Miza, and Mr. Thomas. I think we've had many robust discussions and very fruitful conversations throughout the MiDAS-KAS 2022 conference. Thank you to everyone who is here at Intercontinental Hotel and also joining online, who have joined from start to finish for today's conference. Thank you again to everyone. We'll see you again next year. Now it's back to our MC, Puan Sharmila.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, before we end our session for today, we would like to invite Yang Berusaha, Mr. Noisham bin Rosli, Chief Executive of MiDAS, to deliver his closing remarks.
Thank you. Good evening again. I'm not so sure I'm that excited to speak after listening to Mr. Thomas. Well, anyhow, the formality has to take place. Mrs. Miriam Fisher, Director CAS Malaysia, distinguished speakers, participants, and ladies and gentlemen, good evening again. It is interesting, and it has been really exciting, I must say. Unfortunately, all good thing has to end. I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank all of you for providing us with invaluable information and sharing your ideas and insight with us throughout the various sessions. I am very confident that everyone here has benefited from these sessions, and I sincerely hope that all participants have gained a better understanding and are now equipped with better ideas regarding counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism. Before our conference, let me share several key points from our discourse today. First is the COVID-19 has brought changes to the terrorism and extremism landscape. And since our life is moving back to normal, we must expect the trends of terrorism and extremism to change again. Strong counter-terrorism campaigns in Sabah and the southern Philippines have shown promising results. Improving the southern Philippine social economy has resulted in the decline of ASG, and therefore this effort must be continued and improved. The need for PCVE at the strategic level will be the guideline for all PCVE stakeholders, and an evaluation methodology must be applied to ensure the PCVE efforts are practical. Non-violent radical groups are potential threats as they exploit the freedom to express their opinions to incite and glorify violence without engaging in actual violence. I must say the presentation from Mr. Thomas here really enlightens us very much on that. And as I said, it gives you jittery to speak in public now. Commitment by all parties concerned in improving security and safety will make strategy reject violence. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to put on record our appreciation to Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Syamuddin Bintan Hussein, our Minister of Defence, and the Ministry for the support for this conference. Gratitude also goes to the Embargo General Tan Sri Haji Effendi, our Chief Defence Force. And special thanks and heartfelt thanks to Conrad and the Stifter, Miriam. You have been a very, very good partner and friends, and we've been working together since 2014, as I said it, and I can't see any reason why we shouldn't go on, for as long as we could. Before I conclude, let me reiterate MiDAS' thanks and appreciation to all speakers and participants again. This program would not have been possible without you. God willing, MiDAS-KAS conference will come back in 2023. Okay, thanks to Nadia also. Hope to see you again next year. So, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of our event. On behalf of the organizer, we would like to extend our sincere gratitude to all distinguished speakers and moderator for the insightful and valuable contributions to the success of this conference. Appreciation is also extended to all our distinguished guests for taking the time to be here with us today. Stay safe and have a pleasant evening. Thank you.